Sonal Katyal, and I work as Associate Professor and Program Director for Faculty of Transformational Economics, James Lynn Institute, Switzerland. And I'll be moderator for this session. We have an exciting and informative session planned featuring insights from a true leader in the field of global health and well-being economics. It is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Julia Kim, who is an explorer of the terrain, connecting inner transformation and broader systems change. She draws on her past career as a physician and public health researcher in Africa and Asia, Senior Policy Advisor at United Nations and Program Director at Gross National Happiness Center, Bhutan. She integrates global experience in the field of leadership development, contemplative practice, program facilitation, research, and policy in the fields of well-being economics, global health, and sustainable development. Julia is an associate of the Presensing Institute and an executive member of the Club of Rome and holds degrees from University of Manitoba, Cornell, Tufts, and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. During today's session, Dr. Julia will share valuable insights on sustainability and public health. Following the presentation, we'll have an interactive Q&A session. Please feel free to submit your questions in the chat box and we'll try to address as many as possible. Thank you all for taking the time to be here today. We are confident that you will find this session both enlightening and inspiring. And without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Julia Kim.
Thank you so much, Sonal. It's a pleasure to be joining this group today. I'd like to maybe begin by sharing a few slides, and I'll take you through a bit of an exploration of the topics that you mentioned.
Sure.
So let me just pull up some slides here. Great. Is that coming up for you?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So I'm really wanting to sort of talk about well-being economies as being at the nexus or the crossroads of environmental sustainability and public health. And I'd like to share some of the emerging lessons that are coming from Bhutan and gross national happiness based on a whole systems perspective. So I'll share what I mean by that in a moment. I'll share how gross national happiness may be an example of an integrated approach to health and sustainability and the importance of measuring what matters. And then I'll talk a little bit more about this subject of well-being economies as a whole, sharing some global examples beyond Bhutan, some of the challenges that are being faced and some of the opportunities. So I'd like to begin by sharing a little bit of my story because I think it brings together some of these themes. And the bio, the CV always sounds a little bit daunting. It's always a little bit more messy and unpredictable in real life. You know, I trained as a medical doctor in Canada, and as a young graduate, I went out into the world pretty convinced that I had the tools to, look after the well-being of at least my own patients. I had the opportunity quite early on So when I was working in South Africa and training primary healthcare nurses, we would often celebrate the end of a workshop with a braai. It's like a barbecue and a party, and there was a real sense of connection and community that, even though we were dealing with very serious public health issues, really inspired me and gave me a sense of the importance of continuing. I was at the same time studying for my Master's of Public Health at the London School of Hygiene, and I was struck by the contrast, the sort of solemn faces on the tube, the subway, where people would not actually meet each other's eyes, not talk to each other. And it raised a lot of questions in my mind, although the UK was held up as the developed country, what was happening as we moved towards this advanced economy. From there, I went on to the United Nations in New York and had the opportunity to broaden out more into global health and development, Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals. And at the same time, I was finding myself quite stressed and under pressure. And that's where I began to explore my own resilience and self-care, taking up meditation in a more serious way, because it felt important to deal with the stress and the busyness of a lifestyle that was very different from rural South Africa. Many of my colleagues were also experiencing the same time pressure. And it was there that I had the chance to meet the first Prime Minister of Bhutan when he came to speak about gross national happiness at a high-level meeting in 2012 at the United Nations. And that began my own journey into what seemed to me a really remarkable model for looking at health and development. So I mentioned a systems perspective, and I think for topics like this, it's really helpful to see the whole picture. And systems thinking is a way of framing what we're seeing through looking at the interrelationships rather than the things themselves, for seeing patterns of change rather than snapshots in time. And in that case, really looking at what are the root causes rather than the symptoms. And in this case, we're talking about global health, public health. What are some of the root causes rather than the symptoms of what we're seeing in terms of the health challenges in different places? And this is from Peter Senge, The Art and Practice of Learning Organizations. So we are at a moment of crisis. I think the topic that you brought to this group is really important because we are seeing a public health crisis unfolding. The COVID pandemic was just one recent example, but there are many. We're seeing social crises, Black Lives Matter and other social movements around the world that are challenging the rising inequalities that we are seeing in different parts of the world. The climate crisis, the financial crisis. They're not single and they're not independent. They're very much wrapped around each other. And there have been warning signs that have been building up and in some cases ignored. And the impacts are going to be long lasting. These are not short-term problems. They're also difficult to take in. They affect us personally, and they're deeply embedded in the larger systems that we live in, which can make it feel at times a sense of hopelessness, like they are difficult to challenge or to change. So when you see those combinations, it's often a sign that we're looking at systems problems, not isolated problems. Fortunately, there are very good science and perspectives and analysis of how a systems perspective might look at problems differently. And the model that is often used and which I find really helpful is the iceberg model. So we know that an iceberg, 1/7 of it is above the water, but the majority of it is underneath. We don't see it. So from that perspective, what appears to us in these crises are the visible symptoms, the behaviors, the newspaper headlines. That's what captures most of our attention and where many policymakers tend to focus. But what doesn't appear underneath that are the underlying structures and systems that have led to the kind of problems and crises that we're seeing. And underneath that, even more invisible, the paradigms of thought, the narratives or stories or mental models that we carry that then shape the structures and systems we create. And finally, at the deepest level, you could say the sources of inspiration, the vision, the core values, the purpose or sense of identity that leads to the paradigms of thought and the narratives. And at this level, we are talking about the importance of shifting consciousness and mindsets. Donella Meadows, who is a great systems thinker and an author in the Club of Rome's The Limits to Growth in 1972, said that because mindsets and paradigms guide our behaviors, changing them can have a profound impact on the system. So with that as a backdrop, I'd like to take us into a few mental models that may be familiar to those of us who are on this call. So mental models for health and well-being, we're mostly familiar with the biomedical model, where doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and other healthcare professionals really come together to diagnose and treat symptoms and diseases using the best science and knowledge that we have, the drugs, surgery, and radiation, other modalities. It's a dominant model now for the practice of allopathic or Western medicine since the mid-19th century, and has definitely contributed important advances in managing acute illness and traumatic injury, especially. That's where the strength of the biomedical model lies. The emphasis tends to be on treatment rather than prevention or health promotion. Definitely, we aim to cover prevention and health promotion, but the majority of the budget and the effort is put towards treatment. The problem has, as we've been seeing, is the escalating costs related to the biomedical model and the treatment modalities, and of course, the rising inequalities, both within and between countries. I'd say the biomedical model shows a limited ability to address factors beyond the physical. So whether we're talking about psychological, social, definitely environmental, this is not where the strength of this model lies. So it raises this challenge of really meeting the WHO's definition of health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So in contrast to this, an alternative and perhaps parallel model that folks might be familiar with are the social determinants of health, the non-medical factors that influence health outcomes, many of which I mentioned came to my awareness when I was working in South Africa. So here you see things like the economic stability, social and community context of patients. What kind of neighborhood do people live in? What is their environment, as well as their access to healthcare? What is the educational system doing? And what's interesting is research from the WHO and others shows that social determinants can have a bigger and more important impact than healthcare or life choices in influencing health. In fact, SDH account for 30 to 55% of health outcomes, and compared to the health sector, non-health sectors have greater impact on population health outcomes. SDH both reflect and can impact on inequities. So social determinants of health really highlight the importance of upstream holistic approaches to health, and they focus our attention on development agendas, economic systems, and social policies. So I think this is where we start getting at some of the important intersections with well-being economies. So here I want to talk a little bit about economic mental models, because they also drive and shape the economic systems that we live in. The GDP model, gross domestic product model, is based on this idea of human beings as homo economicus, that we are narrowly self-interested and that we use reasoning to maximize utility and profit. In this case, consumption of goods and services is seen as a primary way to increase our happiness and well-being. GDP, which is the sum of goods and services produced in a country, is therefore the indicator of whether a country is doing well, its success and well-being. And it assumes that unlimited GDP growth on a planet with finite resources is desirable and possible. So you begin to see some of the tensions in this model. In contrast, a well-being economy model would say that economies should be serving people and planet rather than the other way around. And rather than treating GDP growth as an end in itself to be pursued at all costs, it puts our human and planetary well-being needs at the center of economic activities. So it's more of an integrated approach to health and sustainability, in which you look at things like participation, dignity, connection, nature, and fairness as being the needs that we should be pursuing in the economic system. So I want to take a step back and look a little bit at the history of Bhutan and its beginnings of G&H on well-being economics, starting with the visionary fourth king of Bhutan. And in the 1970s, when approached by a reporter who asked, what is the GNP of Bhutan? He replied that gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. So in that moment, really crystallizing the idea that as Bhutan was going to open in the world to globalization, to more engagement and exchange with other countries, the happiness and well-being of its citizens was going to be the center of development. It's interesting that around the same time, a young senator named Robert Kennedy was on the campaign trail and gave a really significant speech at the University of Kansas, which you can find online, in which he said that gross national product measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile, and really critiquing the GNP model, even at that time. So how did we become so obsessed with GDP and growth as the paradigm in most of our countries? Well, it started in the 1940s when gross national product, later gross domestic product, was adopted by the IMF and World Bank, basically to help predict and describe fluctuations in economic growth. And this made sense at the time. We were coming out of World War II and the Great Depression, and there was a need to know what was happening within and across countries in terms of their activities in the economy. But GDP since then has been reported and obsessed with and taken up by politicians as a reflection of a country's success or its progress. And this was never the intention, even by its creator, Simon Kuznets, because it's problematic for three reasons. And these are more and more reported in the academic publications, in some of the books that you will see there, and in policy circles. It's being largely discredited because of what it counts, which is only marketed economic activity. And all of this is counted as positive. It increases the GDP, even if it leads to more pollution or illness, even if there is more crime and you're having to build more prisons. This leads to higher levels of GDP. It's also a problem for what it fails to count. And we know that many of the activities that lead to greater well-being are outside the formal markets, whether you're talking about unpaid care given in homes or in communities, good health and health promotion that doesn't lead to people showing up in hospitals, which increases GDP, and the strength of communities and relationships, not counted in that formula at all. And finally, it's problematic for what it hides, which is uneven growth and rising inequalities. GDP can continue to increase in countries while the quality of life and the economic growth within that community or country is becoming more and more unequal. So some interesting data looking at, for example, the United States, where you're looking at life happiness, life satisfaction in surveys over time versus GDP per capita. And you can see the blue line, GDP per capita, continues to increase, whereas life satisfaction either stays the same or is starting to diminish. And it's interesting that research also suggests that once a certain level of economic development has been reached and adequate material living standards have been met, there's little connection, if any, between rising GDP per capita and well-being. And what matters more in that case is actually things like community well-being, the closeness of relationships, whether people have a sense of trust in the government, whether there is transparency and participation in democracy, whether people have meaningful and secure work and work-life balance. So that may start to sound familiar to some of us in our own countries. Another interesting book, which I would really recommend to people who are interested in this topic, is The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett. And they brought together a lot of the social and economic data across many countries and put together a composite index of well-being and plotted it against income inequality in various countries. And this composite index includes things like life expectancy, literacy levels, social mobility, infant mortality, imprisonment, mental illness, and so forth. And what you see is that in these wealthy countries, as the level of inequality goes up, and the United States is quite high on that level, you'll see on the top right-hand side of the graph, the composite index of these problems get worse. And more equal countries that are experiencing lower levels of this composite index. So again, very interesting and provocative data challenging the supremacy of GDP. So I want to turn back to Bhutan a little bit here and unpack what is meant by gross national happiness. And many people ask me, well, what is happiness? What does that mean? Isn't it everyone have a different sense of happiness in their own lives? And again, the first Prime Minister of Bhutan was very quick to point out when he spoke about G&H to global audiences that happiness here doesn't mean feeling good, these brief moments of hedonia, what psychological researchers would call hedonia. Obviously, you can't govern a country based on fleeting moods. And so he really said that the kind of lasting, abiding happiness we're talking about cannot exist while others suffer and comes only from serving others, living in harmony with nature, and realizing our innate wisdom. So a very deep and profound definition of happiness. And many of the leaders who are taking forward G&H in the country say that it is fundamentally about balancing both material and spiritual development, and that the well-being of humans and the entire web of life are important. It's not anthropocentric. It's about changing the outer systems, new measurements, new policies, and the kind of shift in consciousness, the values and mindsets that are very much a part of the measures and the policies. So in terms of the measurement, the G&H survey, which is undertaken roughly every 3 years or so as a national population-based survey, looks at 9 domains or 9 buckets of 33 indicators to look at this holistic approach. And it includes health as well as many of the social determinants of health, such as living standards, education, community vitality, and the environment. And beyond that, other important domains that have been found to impact on our sense of well-being, the time use that I mentioned, cultural diversity and resilience, good governance. And these are seen as interdependent, and they create an enabling environment for health and well-being. A government can't ensure that you'll be happy or well. It can't force you to be happy or well, but it can take the responsibility for creating an enabling environment where people can be happy and flourish. It's important to point out that it's not about increasing the G&H values for those who are already at the top of the charts, who are doing well. For each domain in the survey, there's a sufficiency threshold that is set, where you would say, how much is enough to be happy in that domain? And taken as a whole, a happiness threshold would be established where, as long as an individual reaches that sufficiency threshold in 6 out of 9 domains, they would be considered to be happy in the survey. So that allows for some diversity and difference within individuals. It focuses on enabling as many people as possible to meet the sufficiency thresholds and to understand who is falling behind, so that can guide policy and action. And it counters this belief that ever-grading production and ever-increasing production and consumption is either desirable or feasible. So it's important to go beyond the vision and the measurement to action. And in Bhutan, because the country is building on this vision of happiness and well-being of all life that has been really handed down from the leadership of the kings, the measurement is very important to know whether we're going in the right direction. So the survey that I mentioned, undertaken by the Center for Bhutan Studies and G&H Research. And then it needs to be met by the ears of policymakers. And there is a screening tool to guide policies, and the G&H Commission, which has in the past been playing the key role in doing that, now being decentralized more into various government bodies in Bhutan, and then applying it in action. And the organization I've been working with, the GNH Center Bhutan, really bringing it into business, education, leadership development, working with young people and youth in Bhutan. So altogether, getting below the surface of that iceberg model that I mentioned earlier, both the vision and values, the sources of inspiration, the mental models, so well-being as the purpose of the economy, and then the structures, the measures, the policy, and the action to support that. So how do the policies align with this ambitious vision and aspiration? One of the first things people notice when they land in Bhutan is a lack of billboard advertising. So really trying to turn out the noise of not enoughness, of the constant barrage of not having enough and of marketing. I think a lot of the social and economic policies are focused on caring for people, universal free basic health and education, even though the GDP is not as large as many wealthier countries that are not prioritizing health and education. Teachers and healthcare workers are some of the highest paid civil servants in the country. We've committed to keeping at least 60% of the country under forest cover for all time. This has made Bhutan one of the first and only carbon negative countries in the world. So again, there could be a lot of pressure to cut down forests, to use the timber, to increase the GDP, has to be counterbalanced with this idea of environmental sustainability. And I think because Bhutan has been very much immersed in a Buddhist culture and values for a long time, nature is considered sacred. And there's a ban on mountaineering, which has led to some of the highest untouched peaks in the world being found in Bhutan. This also results in the high value, low impact tourism policy, which means balancing the number of tourists coming into the country and reducing the tourism income in order to protect some of the social and environmental wealth of the country. Cultivating a sense of values and inner leadership, meditation, and GNH values in the education system. All of this while advancing key social indicators in the country. So impressive reductions in poverty and infant mortality rates, rising life expectancy and primary school enrollment in the country, and an increase in the Human Development Index, placing Bhutan into the middle human development category. This isn't to say that Bhutan isn't facing challenges or that the model is perfect. Definitely, there are challenges which are being identified by policymakers and by the surveys. In the latest 2015 survey, or the last survey, there's a current survey that's just been released. Farmers were seen to be less happy than other occupations. Women were less happy than men, which is interesting. And for the first time, Bhutanese youth were less happy than other age groups. So as a policymaker, that should pique your interest. And you should be asking, what is going on? What are some of the implications? Some of the emerging responses have been improving the rural infrastructure, increasing electricity, improving roads, initiatives to improve women's empowerment and political participation, and tackling increasing youth unemployment, the exposure to social media and globalization. So I think like many countries, young people are more and more exposed to these different messages and different values, strengthening the roles of civil society and of business in promoting GNH in the country. So all in all, if you were to speak to the leaders in Bhutan, they are actually quite humble and realistic about GNH as being a journey rather than a destination. And really to counter the Shangri-La myth that Bhutan is this kind of idealized country in the clouds. As the first Prime Minister of Bhutan said, Bhutan is not a country that has attained GNH. Like most developing nations, we struggle with the challenge of meeting basic needs. But I think what separates us from many other countries is that we've made happiness the foundation of human needs as a goal of societal change. So with that in mind, I I'd like to take us through kind of a fun activity that the G&H Center has designed to kind of take this complex survey at a population level and bring it down into a easier, smaller sized individual survey with just a few questions, adapting the 9 domains so that we can get a sense of what they mean and how they impact on our own lives. So for those of you who have a pen and paper, I'm going to just take us through a mini G&H survey and ask you to reflect on your own life as I go through these questions. So in this case, we're going on a scale of 1 to 10, where if you score 10, it's excellent, and 1 would be very poor. And don't think about it too much. Just go with your first instinct when I ask the question. So living standards. I feel confident I have enough financial security to meet my needs and that of my family. Just think about that for a moment and give yourself a score from 1 to 10. Number 2, education. I have enough learning opportunities to meet the shifting challenges in my professional career. So think about it. You're probably engaged in some kind of educational program if you're on this Zoom call, or maybe you're working already. Just think about the education opportunities you have and give yourself a score. Number 3, health. My lifestyle supports good physical and mental health. Just take a moment to check in with yourself. How are you doing? And again, you don't have to share this with anybody. This is your own personal self-assessment. Number 4, environment. In my school or workplace, there's a high level of awareness and responsibility towards the environment. Just think about how you would score that. Number 5, community vitality. When I faced a personal crisis, I felt I had enough support from my community. And you can define that community however you like. It can be colleagues, friends, people in the place where you live. Just think about the support you've had during a personal crisis. As I mentioned earlier, this one comes up very strongly in research as being important to our sense of well-being. Number 6, time use. I have enough time to do the things I enjoy with friends and family. So again, as I mentioned, in many surveys in high GDP countries, this is proving to be really important. And the lack of time is leading to a sense of not being well, being stressed. Number 7, psychological well-being. I feel there's good alignment between my sense of life purpose and my work. So this is an interesting one for professionals. If there is a lack of alignment, often this leads to a sense of discouragement or depression, unhappiness. Number 8, good governance. In my school or my work environment, I feel there's a good level of transparency and trust in leadership. So again, to give you a sense of how this connects to well-being. Just give yourself a score there. And finally, number 9, cultural diversity and resilience. Where I live or work, cultural diversity is seen as a positive contribution to society. So in other words, there isn't discrimination, there isn't othering, there isn't a sense of people having to hide their diversity. So you can give a score there. So if we were to plot this on a kind of spider diagram, you might notice that there are some places where you're scoring more highly than others. And maybe take a moment now to reflect on your own life. What are the areas where you're thriving? Which of the 9 domains are strongest in your life? And maybe why did you rate them more highly? So often in our busyness, we don't have a chance to reflect on our lives in this way. Just take a moment to do that. Where are you doing well? And conversely, where do you need more attention? Which of the 9 domains are weakest in my life, and why? Why did I rate them lower? Just take a moment to jot that down. So it's interesting, when I've done this survey myself, depending on different times in my life, the domains have appeared quite different. It often provokes some interesting insights. Okay. Yeah, what does it evoke for you? So just take a moment to think about the feelings that come up. Or maybe there's an intention or a wish to pay attention to one area. Maybe it raises some questions for you about well-being and how it connects to these broader systems elements. Some of them may be within your control, others may not be. And what does that bring up for you? Okay, so I want to kind of spend the last bit of my presentation going beyond Bhutan, and to talk a little bit about why the shift in mindset matters globally, and a little bit more about well-being economies and other examples outside of Bhutan. So I mentioned the great systems thinker and scientist Donella Meadows earlier. She had this amazing quote, which I think is very relevant to our times. People don't need enormous cars. They need admiration and respect. They don't need a constant stream of new clothes. They need to feel that others consider them to be attractive, and they need excitement and variety and beauty. People don't need electronic entertainment. They need something interesting to occupy their minds and emotions. Trying to fill real but non-material needs for identity, community, self-esteem, challenge, love, joy with material things is to set up an unquenchable appetite for false solutions to never satisfied longings. This is such a perfect setup to the Earth Charter, which says that fundamental changes are needed in our values, institutions, and ways of living. We must realize that when basic needs have been met, human development is primarily about being more, not having more. So again, to say that we do need to meet basic needs, in many countries, these have not been met. But in many countries of the world, many influential countries, they have been largely met for a good amount of the population. And yet the GDP model is propelling ongoing consumption and ongoing sense of lack of sufficiency, to the detriment of those who still need to meet basic needs, and to the detriment of our planet. So it's interesting that many people speak of the attention economy, the fact that we're constantly being pulled away by marketing, advertising, social media. And this is an interesting publication in Science called A Distracted Mind is an Unhappy Mind. And it's quite an elegant design, where Harvard researchers used a smartphone app to track volunteers, and they would ping these volunteers at different points and ask, how happy are you? What are you currently doing? Were you thinking about what you're currently doing, or about something else? And what they found was that on average, we spend almost half of our waking hours thinking about something other than what we're doing. And this mind wandering typically makes us feel unhappy. They concluded that mind wandering is an excellent predictor of unhappiness. In fact, it's a better predictor than the actual activity we're engaged in. So it's not so much whether we're having dinner with somebody that we love or whether we're doing dishes. It's whether we're actually aware of and present with that dinner or aware and present with doing the dishes. What's concerning is that studies are showing how much time, especially kids, now are spending on our devices, more than 7 hours a day gazing at screens. And this raises really important questions about the ability to stay connected with what we're doing and therefore to actually promote our sense of well-being. Fortunately, there's some interesting neuroscience coming out of various research institutes that are connecting what you might call ancient wisdom traditions with modern science. And the idea that we're not only connected to our genetics and to our habits, but we have the capacity to cultivate our ability to stay aware and to be present. That the ability of the brain continues to be shaped by experience, not just beyond up to childhood and adolescence, but well into adulthood, and that this can actually be seen through functional MRI scans, that the neurological wiring is changing. They studied meta-awareness, the ability to remain aware of what we're doing in the moment, and found that it's trainable and is connected to a range of health and well-being benefits. Our ability to cope with stress, our ability to rebound from negative emotions and to sustain positive ones, and even to cultivate what they call pro-social behaviors, generosity, altruism, compassion, in a time when we are constantly being challenged and pushed in ways that counter those pro-social behaviors. So Richard Davidson at the Center for Healthy Minds has said that with this kind of research, we now know that exercising our minds should be approached in much the same way we exercise our bodies. We don't just assume that our physical health and our physical well-being is determined by our genes. We can actually work on our well-being. So their Healthy Minds program, which has been based on much of this research, focuses on 4 pillars of well-being: awareness, connection, so appreciation, kindness, compassion, insight into the stories we tell ourselves, how our minds work, and then the sense of purpose, the values, the principles, staying motivated even amidst challenges. And this is being applied in education with teachers, healthcare workers, in the business environment, and climate and social justice activism. So it's interesting that Dr. Davidson had a conversation with Dr. Vivek Murthy, who is the Surgeon General of the United States, and a really interesting interview for those who want to find it on YouTube, where Dr. Murthy mentioned that this concept of well-being didn't really come up very much in his own medical training. We are very focused on eliminating disease, an important endeavor, but it felt like half the story. And now as Surgeon General, he's really thinking a lot about well-being because we have the opportunity now to see health in its broader sense and to redefine public health, not just as the absence of disease, but really as an endeavor we all need to undertake to cultivate our ability to live at the high end of our scale. And through that, to enjoy life and contribute to the people around us. And not only that, contribute also to society in a way that can move all of us forward. So quite an inspiring message from the Surgeon General. So in Bhutan, we're taking this seriously in terms of learning and leadership for well-being economies. A lot of our work is focusing on these leadership capacities to address the root causes of these complex economic, social, and environmental crises. In different ways, we're helping others, organizations, and individuals to adapt the 9 domains at the individual and organizational level through action learning labs. A few examples here that we've undertaken with Schumacher College in the UK, Windhorse Farm in Canada, the Global Wellbeing Lab with the Presencing Institute and the Global Leadership Academy in Germany, and Leadership for Wellbeing and Equity, which we undertook with support from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for Health Leaders in the United States and Canada. So again, trying to bring this into a practical level for people working in different fields. In general, well-being economies is becoming a bit of a global movement. I would encourage folks who are interested to look up Well-Being Economy Alliance, and a network now of over 200 organizations, movements, and individuals that are working to transform from the GDP economy towards an economic system that sustains life. WeGo is the part of Well-Being Economy Alliance that focus on governments and leaders in particular countries that are committed to moving in this direction. New Zealand, Scotland, Iceland, Wales, Finland are some examples. At the city level, there's been really important innovations and progress, some led by economists like Kate Raworth, where people are attempting to apply well-being economies to the city level, if the whole country level is not really able to move in that direction. And the Club of Rome recently published Earth for All, a survival guide for humanity, that talks about 5 key turnarounds in which well-being economies also features that could move us from the kind of business as usual, too little, too late model towards one that would actually tilt us towards a more flourishing and sustainable world. In May of last year, at a regional level, the EU Parliament had a Beyond Growth conference, which was opened by the President of the EU Commission. So again, really important conversations and policy engagement around well-being economies. So in summary, I really want to bring us back to this polycrisis, the multiple crises that we find ourselves in now, and really encourage us to get beyond the symptom level. Really, we were looking beyond the surface and thinking about systems. And in doing that, we looked at the biomedical model and the social determinants of health models, also looked at the GDP model versus well-being economics. So again, the importance of the mental models and how they shape the underlying systems. And I spoke a bit about the paradigm shift, the experiment that Bhutan has undertaken, where they dare to ask what kind of growth, not just we need growth, but what kind of growth do we want? And in this case, measuring what matters. A holistic approach that's integrating health, well-being, and sustainability goals within the 9 domains, and really trying to move from vision to action, having the survey influence policy, and then in turn application. And some of the lessons and applications, the challenges we're facing in terms of well-being economies, the importance of leadership in moving us forward, and some of the global examples, the new initiatives that are happening at the organization level, in businesses, in cities, and at the country level. So I want to just conclude with quoting 2 of my favorite people, and 2 really visionary voices from the West and the East. Everybody recognizes Albert Einstein. And he said, "The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking." And the Buddha from the East, over 2,500 years ago, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." So quite an extraordinary resonance and similarity between what they are sharing here. So I will stop my slides there, and happy to engage with you, Sonal, if there are any questions, comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Julia, for the fantastic presentation. Now let's dive into the questions. Participants, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. Anyone, any questions?
Dr. Kim, I have one question, and I would ask it on behalf of everybody. As I noticed during the lecture, it's a lecture which is enlightening. This is not, the lecture of yours was not related to any particular topic which is in a course curriculum, but it is the curriculum of our life. It is how life has shaped nowadays in the modern day endeavors, and post-COVID, everything has changed even further, a little bit of an understanding how we should shape our lives, looking into more public health, even economies at a macro level, looking more into public health. But my question is very fundamental. Most of the countries where the happiness index is very high, and one of them, say Bhutan, you talked about and you shared your experiences with us today. What would be the case with larger economies, bigger countries with bigger problems? So how would you extrapolate the models at Bhutan, say with India, with China, with the US, or with Russia? How would the larger countries, maybe not always larger in terms of population, but in terms of the infrastructure they have, so how would that translate in the micro level, at the individual level, at the indices of happiness? So are there something which can be extrapolated? Can we extrapolate the model of Bhutan in a country like India, in a country like China, and other larger countries?
Yeah, thank you for that excellent question. I mean, I think when you look at very large countries or large economies, it's very difficult to make a big change all at once. And I think that's where, for example, working at smaller levels of scale. So for example, cities or organizations or business starts to begin a transformation of the mindsets and starts to bring across examples of it working in certain areas. In many cases, political leaders are elected and disappear in 4 years, and they will promise everything at the beginning, and then it's gone. We're all familiar with that. However, I've spoken to many mayors of cities who are elected and live in the place where they're very visible and accountable to their constituencies. And they feel they have more of an ability to influence what's happening at the city level. So I think that's a very promising place to start, even within these large countries at the city level. And some of the examples that I cited are happening at the city level in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in various places. Cities are applying donut economics or well-being economies and connecting with each other to make those happen. There's also, within these large economies, business plays a huge role, obviously. And within business, there's a question of whether they're just greenwashing with new metrics that are trying to look at sustainability, or where there's really an effort to transform business. And because many in business are also experiencing a lack of well-being, there's a lot of burnout and a lot of dissatisfaction. This idea of bringing well-being and well-being economics to the business sphere is also important. So I think those are important. And then I would finally say that even where individual countries are not able to move in that direction, and you listed some of them, a regional level can have power. So I mentioned the European Union. When a number of countries decide we're tired of GDP as the model, we're seeing the impacts on climate change and inequality, let's look at a different model. Even though not all the countries will adopt it, there is a sense of a challenge to that model. And I think that's really important. So I hope that responds to some of your questions.
Absolutely.
There's one question from a student. The student is asking that, is there an analysis comparing how a higher GNH would impact positively or negatively the GDP? This is in regard to the LMICs, which also do need to increase their productions to support their population basic needs.
Yeah, that's a very good question. In fact, I would say that even in a country like Bhutan, there is a constant tension between how much economic development and how much GNH. And I think they're not necessarily at odds, but it has to be a careful balance. living standards is one of the 9 domains of G&H. So it's not like it's completely absent from gross national happiness. Meeting basic needs to be part of it. But I would say there isn't a direct comparison, like does GDP or gross national product or gross national product or gross domestic product decrease if you pursue G&H or well-being economies. I don't think that's a linear relationship at all. One interesting comparison that I would say the person who's interested should check out would be an index called GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator. And what that does is it takes GDP and it instead of just measuring the positive outcomes of GDP growth, it measures the negative externalities. So it shows up what happens. It takes GDP and counts the negative consequences on health and on environment, on social outcomes, and then subtracts it from the value of GDP. So it's a more realistic view of what is actually happening with GDP. I think that would be more interesting than trying to directly compare GDP and G&H. But it's a good question. And definitely the priorities for middle-income countries, least developed countries is very different from countries that are developed or overly developed. Thanks for that question.
There's another question from Dr. Adil. He's asking, don't we need GDP to achieve G&H?
Similar to the earlier question, I think many people tend to separate them into 2 contradictory things. G&H means let's forget about economic development. I think absolutely economic development is important and G&H is important. The problem with GDP is it's now taken as a measure of how a country is doing. And it's covering up a lot of the indicators that I mentioned earlier. It's masking rising inequality. It needs to be dethroned as a measure of how a country is doing, but it's still important in terms of measuring consumption and production. Why not keep measuring that? But to say that countries should be prioritizing GDP growth over everything else, that is problematic, and it's misleading, and it's covering up the environmental damage and the social damage. So I think, yes, we could keep measuring GDP. Let's look at it and give attention to it for what it actually is. And let's find better measures for what we want to be measuring in terms of well-being, happiness, sustainability.
Okay, one last question. Steve is asking, how are those 9 Bhutan principles thought of? Some societies are mostly socialistic, like the sub-Saharan Africa. Our thoughts are also driven based on our immediate environment as spouses, patients, citizens, though these principles are mostly personal.
Can you say the last part of that, Sonal? I missed in our many countries.
Yeah,
in our country.
so like if Steve is from sub-Saharan Africa, so he's saying that their thoughts are mostly driven based on their immediate environment, such as spouses, patients, entrepreneurs, citizens, though these principles are mostly personal in nature.
Yeah, so I would say that the 9 domains were brought together by the Bhutanese in consultation with others who are kind of looking at measurement and looking at well-being from many disciplines. So in some sense, the 9 domains are a little bit supported by what research and science shows, but with a good deal of understanding what's relevant in the Bhutanese context. Statistically, there was a lot of support from things like the Multidimensional Poverty Index to actually analyze these domains and come up with a numbers is very complex. But I would say that, even in Bhutan, they would say these are not written in stone. In different contexts, if different domains were found to be important and they're measurable, they should be included. And even in Bhutan, if over time one domain needs to be replaced by another, they would be open to doing it. So I think there is some room for that. I would also say that these elements are relevant at the individual and personal level and the community level. The way the survey was adapted and the way we did it here was very much, in your own life, in the individual life. But you can imagine a survey that's doing that at a population level. It'll give you a sense of what's happening, say, in one part of the sub-Saharan Africa country versus another, comparing men and women, comparing North and South, comparing young and old. And with that, you would start to get a sense of what's important. So I hope that that's helpful in answering that question.
With one more question, how should one balance the pursuit of happiness and being satisfied with what we have? This is in relation to applying the GNH wheel personal assessment and applying to our personal life and goals.
So what we would normally do in a GNH workshop, if we were in Bhutan, for example, is after doing that 9 domains, take a moment to journal, to reflect. And whoever asked that question, I would invite them to do that with that question in mind. So in some areas, is there a sense of sufficiency? Actually, is there enough? And how much of that feeling of not enough is being driven by, I think the expression now is FOMO, fear of missing out, or a sense of comparison with social peers? Or how much it is a genuine need? Is there an actual lack? So there's a moment of reflection. I think that is important. And then often a conversation is helpful. So I've had some groups, often the groups would then pair up and you would have that conversation with another. And hearing in someone else's 9 domains and having that conversation often brings insight as well. In some of our workshops, it's been interesting that people have done it with partners, so husband and wife, for example, or they've done it as a family activity. And the insights that come when you do that can be really interesting. What does your partner feel? If you consider your family as a kind of community, what kind of insights does that give? And that will also give you a sense of what is actually enough versus what is a desire or a want that maybe doesn't need to be fulfilled or ultimately can't be fulfilled. So I think it's a great question.
Yeah. There's another question. How can one effect these changes, maybe in the workplace, without necessarily being on the leadership side of the table?
Brilliant question. So we did some work with an organization, a business in Thailand, where it was actually the leadership needed to be on board in principle, in support of bringing GNH or well-being into the business. And they were very committed to it. And then they were wise, I think, in allowing representatives from different parts of the business to then step forward and take ownership of it. And it actually began with adapting the survey in that context, and then forming groups of people who are committed to finding different ways to shape the organization, identifying the areas where they were weak and moving it forward. I would say both are important. Without the buy-in and the support of leadership, I think you would soon kind of hit a wall. But they're often really busy and they don't have time and they don't really know what's going on at the kind of grassroots level. But they also need to create space for people to be able to do that. If they're going to be taking on this extra activity, if they are going to be trying to improve well-being in the workplace, they need to acknowledge that, give them time and support for that, promote that, and then let them run with the ball. So I think there's different approaches.
Okay. So how do you think economists can influence the shift to well-being economics or even a hybrid model at a country level?
So it's interesting that economists are sometimes part of the problem. And you'll hear that with some of the critical and new thinking, new economics thinkers. Kate Raworth describes herself as a recovering economist, because most of them and many of the economics programs are still very much teaching the GDP model. And so the ability to think outside of that framework is really important. I think within governments that are bringing in some of this new thinking and are open to challenging the current paradigm, there is a lot of interesting engagement that is happening. There are conferences. I was just in one that was happening in Costa Rica, where representatives of government and economists, policymakers, and activists were getting together to look at how could it be implemented. I think the activist component is also important. I think if people stay within government and economists only speak to economists or policymakers only speak to policymakers, there's very little room for injection of ideas or challenging of old paradigms. But when you bring a more diverse group together, then the possibility of new ideas start to come forward. So the Costa Rica meeting, I thought, was very challenging and very productive for that reason.
Student is asking, is there actually lower prevalence or incidence of mental health in Bhutan compared to developed and industrial countries?
You know, it's hard to directly compare. What I would say is that there is more, I think there's been more problems with mental health. It's been increasing in recent years, particularly after COVID. I think we've seen that in a lot of countries, particularly among young people. So that's alerted them to that. I would say that compared to developed countries, psychological well-being, mental health, probably better in Bhutan up until recent years when we start to see those changes, particularly in young people. You know, to be completely subjective based on my own time traveling between Bhutan and the United States, North America, well-being of young people, psychological well-being in Bhutan seemed more sound, seemed better. The pace of life was slower. People were more connected to community. There was more a sense of feeling that support. Whereas in North America, people are very much on their own, don't know their neighbors, huge sense of loneliness. And when something does happen, they don't really know who has their back, to be honest. Their closest friends live far away. Their family is not in the city. They don't know who's going to help them if something happens. So that close-knit sense of community is still very strong in Bhutan, and that's very much related to mental health.
From a systems perspective, how to make change in a country with a democratic system where the majority of the population has a very low level of literacy, where the rulers rely on the majority with the low level of education to keep on power.
Wow, now we're asking the very deep systems question. You know, I don't pretend to have the answers to that, those kinds of questions. I think, you know, there's a reason why education is one of the 9 domains in G&H, and an educated population is so important. I mean, we're seeing that in developed and developing countries in that without that, even the functioning of democracy, even the functioning of voting, if people don't understand what are they voting for, what are the options, how do we hold our leaders accountable, how do we untangle the political message on social media from what is actually happening, then it's very fragile. So I think education, not just in the sense of formal education, though that's very important. People need to be literate. They need to have primary and secondary school education. But many people are saying these days, even that is not enough. You know, the kind of colonial industrial education that teaches kids to memorize and to just recite back what they learned and does not teach critical thinking, does not teach a sense of awareness and confidence. In order to be a good citizen and a global citizen these days, even the education system needs to transform. So that's a huge other conversation. And there are conferences now looking at G&H and education, well-being in education, alternative education systems, eco-universities, that I think get at the heart of what that question was asking. But maybe we should stop there before we get to even more complicated questions.
Yeah. I have one question for you to end this. So what are the emerging trends that you see at the intersection of environmental sustainability and achieving the public health goals?
I think there's growing awareness from the health and public health community, having been a member of that community, to what are the limitations of the biomedical model that I mentioned, and the need to start addressing issues like climate change in a serious way. Still very much focused on the impacts of climate on health, and that's understandable. I mean, that's where the intersection is most visible: rising temperatures, climate instability, rise in tropical diseases in areas that haven't seen it before, rise in infectious diseases. Of course, that intersection is very important. But I would say that I haven't heard yet from the public health and global health community the connection, support, and advocacy for shifting the economic system. That would be really powerful if we had public health experts, physicians, people working in healthcare saying that from a systems perspective, we need to be looking at the economic models that are driving our healthcare system. That would add a lot of momentum to the well-being economy movement. I haven't seen that connection happen yet. I think the fact that the biomedical model of healthcare is fraying at the edges, healthcare workers are getting burnt out. The medical model is getting really expensive and unsustainable, and health inequalities are growing. We can't deliver basic healthcare to everybody using these models and disregarding the economic system is a really powerful wake-up call to the public health community that we need to become systems thinkers. We need to be bringing that into our educational fora. We need to be activists in addressing these larger institutions, because we can't face the health challenges and the public health challenges unless we look at these interdependencies. So I think, you're hosting transformational economics, you're inviting this kind of conversation is a really important stepping stone. So really expressing my appreciation for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking all the questions. Now I would like to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Sohail for the closing remarks. I think you are on mute. Dr. Sohail, we can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry for that. Thank you so much, Dr. Sonal, for organizing this session. And it's really an honor to have Dr. Julia Kim here with us. And it's been enlightening, not only knowing about how economics and public health can marry and create the right mix. The two models at the two ends, the economic models, the public health models, would create the right mix with the systems thinking at the center stage. Well, this is an evolving science. This is an evolving art. I would say sometimes public health is an art as well, not only science, not only medical science or other type of sciences together. It has to be the right art to put the pieces together. Dr. Julia, it has been really enlightening. It's been a pleasure to host you today here with our students, with our viewers. We would like to keep learning from you and keep learning from your experiences, keep learning from your knowledge. And we would like you to engage with our institution in much more detail and much more in depth, so that our students keep on getting enlightened and we all enlighten from your knowledge. Thank you so much, and let's stay connected, and let's come back together once again. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining the session. Thank you. Really appreciate it.